When you talk about Esperanto, you must talk about the Tower of Babel. Man's arrogance scaled to pierce the heavens. A curse. Language lost and the chaos of nations emerging from the lack of common tongue. When you talk about Esperanto, you must talk about Eden, a reconciled world as yet unscarred, and then a curse. The creation myth of Esperanto was the desire to draw a line backwards from the multilingual chaos of Babel to the monolingual peace found in the original paradise. When you talk about Incubus, you must talk about language, and of course, the deaths, the failure, the disappearance, but you must also talk about the curse. If you ask William Shatner about his 1966 film Incubus, be prepared to hear a lot about hippies. Specifically, the one hippie, Shatner claims, that cursed the film and everyone involved in its production. If you talk to anyone else about the film Incubus, be prepared to talk about nothing other than the strange, constructed language created in the late 19th century known as Esperanto. When you talk about Esperanto, you must talk about trains. The constructed language Esperanto was the brainchild of an idealistic Jewish man, L.L. Zamenhof, born 1859. He was raised in what is now Poland, but would frequently travel across a tumultuous Europe before dying in 1917. At his 19th birthday party, he presented his close friends with the language he had created, convinced a shared language might enact a shared ethos, bridging the cultural divide he saw everywhere and felt deeply as a Jew at the time. He and his friends sang a universalist hymn in this new language, and then these newly indoctrinated pupils promptly abandoned the language. Frustrated, he traveled from region to region for a few years before abandoning metaphor entirely by opening eyes literally as an ophthalmologist in Warsaw in 1885. The specifics of the language he presented on his birthday have now been lost to time. It's estimated that 75% of all silent films have been lost forever. But there's a rich history of lost films being recovered. 1928's masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc, by Carl Theodor Dreyer, was thought to be lost forever until a janitor found a few film canisters while cleaning out a closet in a mental institution in Norway. The original cut of Fritz Lang's celebrated Metropolis was thought lost forever, leaving us with a film purportedly only a quarter of the length of the original. But over the past several decades, more and more footage is found and cobbled back in, resulting in enough alternate versions of the film to make even Ridley Scott blush. And if you're anything like me, with every extended version, there may be a shameful, niggling voice not expressed in polite company that, maybe the movie was a bit better when it didn't run for a very dry 2.5 hours. There's also movies that are simply hidden away.
4 heroes on a daring mission in space.
It's clobber time.
Like 1994's Fantastic Four movie, which now you can actually watch in all its, glory. Or the notorious directorial effort of comedian Jerry Lewis, The Day the Clown Cried, where he plays a clown in a concentration camp. We know the spoiler ending, wherein Lewis's clown ends up leading the Jewish children at the camp to their demise in the gas chambers. This ending has gained a lot of notoriety, but I'll be the weirdo that admits, after reading the plot summary, I can imagine a world in which it actually works. To my mind, it tonally could correspond to Life is Beautiful, which also has a very similar premise that seems absurd on paper. But I also must face facts, that this was directed by Jerry Lewis. A comedian whose comedy was so broad, mostly he was just loved by the French, who incidentally co-signed the film. As a heads up, the French embracing unusual things is going to be a bizarrely consistent trend for the rest of this essay. Incubus director Leslie Stevens' previous film, made in 1960, Private Property, was thought to be lost until 2015. I must admit, I only discovered this one while doing research for this essay, and it is a wild one.
I also got a knife, Ed. I'm just going to shove it 10 inches into your belly and split you wide open like a dead sheep.
Condemned by the Catholic Legion of Decency, and purportedly a film that disturbed Jackie Kennedy to the point that she publicly commented on it. It's a wild ride if you can stomach the themes. A truly psychosexual thriller, the film follows 2 dangerous criminals, a smarter one and a dumber one, played by a young Warren Oates.
I've been ready to make it ever since you took that redhead away from me up there in that orange grove.
You want one?
You gonna fix me up?
I'll fix you up.
The smart one promises his friend that he can get him laid when they see a beautiful housewife drive by in a snazzy sports car.
You like that?
They follow her home, and the lead criminal initiates a plot to seduce the woman so that he can somehow turn her over to his dim-witted friend when the time comes for sex. It's pretty remarkable how the dread of seemingly inevitable sexual violence permeates the film, ratcheting up the intensity. The direction and performances are quite good. The lead actress who plays the housewife was Stevens' then wife. In 1964, they would divorce, and shortly after, she would take her own life. And that is, unfortunately, an appropriate transition into his 1966 film Incubus, a strange movie starring William Shatner that was filmed entirely in the constructed language of Esperanto. The film was thought to be lost as the custodians of the negatives, CFI, destroyed the negatives for no discernible reason, one of the many famous examples of the curse that haunted the film's production. In 1966, producer Anthony Taylor discovered that there actually was a surviving print of the film found in, you guessed it, France. The print was in serviceable condition, enough that it could be restored, but an unfortunate consequence is that the surviving edition has French subtitles burned into the celluloid. This means that for any other translation of the Esperanto, namely English for our purposes, has to have these obnoxious black bars to cover up the French subtitles. Further exacerbating the problem is that the film was shot in open matte, which essentially is a square aspect ratio that was then meant to be projected with soft matting, ultimately resulting in the intended widescreen. I bring this up because since the film was projected with soft matting, the subtitles were proportionally raised further up in the frame to accommodate the original dimensions, and therefore, now, we not only have giant subtitles with black bars, but they are placed aggravatingly high in the frame, such that they never cease feeling uncomfortable all the way through to the end, like having a persistent canker sore throughout the duration of the film's runtime. The decision to make the film in Esperanto, while strange, I might argue rides well within the rails of the genre. In fact, I'd argue horror as a genre has proven to be the most robust of all genres for smuggling in fascinating cultural curios and uniquely ambitious aims. In my experience, horror is one of the most common and fertile fields for academic film essays to explore. Purportedly highbrow prestige films that win Oscars often don't age particularly well in the public consciousness, and don't often endure as rewatchable films outside of their era, outside of highlighting, well, what people felt a prestigious film should look like. Meanwhile, lowbrow genres like the lowly quote-unquote women's picture, or sex comedy, or film noir, and of course horror, have endless surplus of exploratory academic essays, and the films themselves remain incredibly popular in film nerd communities. So, to me, Incubus opting to film in Esperanto in 1966 strangely tracks with the tradition of a genre that accepts all shapes and kinds. Consider 1975's horror film Defula, which was made entirely in American Sign Language.
Go over there. Tie the girl on the motorcycle. Drive over the cliff.
If your curiosity follows that strand, you might come across the promising Wikipedia entry entitled Disability in Horror Films, which is unfortunately a bit threadbare. Of course, it covers the usual suspects, namely Todd Browning's output, like his banned 1932 masterpiece Freaks, which features real carnival sideshow performers of the time.
We've got personality. We know how to sell the stuff.
And really deserves its own episode on this channel.
We're only killing time with this circus.
But this under-delivering Wikipedia entry did uncover one potential gem for me, 2016's Spring Break Zombie Massacre, which was written by and stars two buddies with Down syndrome, and it looks like an absolute blast.
Hey zombie, get back here, bitch!
But why make this movie in Esperanto in the first place? To answer that, we need to talk about the director Leslie Stevens. Stevens was the series creator of the legendary 1960s series The Outer Limits, which was a sci-fi anthology series inspired heavily by The Twilight Zone and has one of the greatest opening sequences of all time.
Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image. Series episodes vacillate between typical Monster of the Week fare and more serious sci-fi concepts. The episodes feature the quintessential tone and wonderful texture of 1960s atomic age sci-fi.
Where am I? What planet is this?
It is called Earth.
And since they're short, you can luxuriate in that aesthetic of the show's episodes without having to endure the mind-numbing boredom of a longer feature film of that era. Look upon these wonderful creatures and tell me you're not charmed. One of the most consistent writers on the show was Joseph Stefano. Stefano contributing to The Outer Limits is interesting because Stefano is most known for being the screenwriter for Psycho, Why do I bring that up? Well, because Psycho was of course commissioned and directed by Hitchcock, who peeled off the crew and talent from his own anthology show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I always found it so fascinating that the Hitchcock film with arguably the greatest sustaining cultural resonance was a low-budget, quick and dirty slasher film made with a TV crew and against the wishes of Paramount, for whom he was under contract to make another movie. And Psycho is so unlike any of his other films, which were generally pretty glossy thrillers, outside of his fantastic late feature, Frenzy, which is a surprisingly vicious movie in its own right. I can't help but suspect that the outsized success of Psycho on such a small budget influenced Stevens' calculation of migrating over his team from the Outer Limits to work on his own idiosyncratic gamble of a feature film. Stevens fingered William Shatner for the main role in Incubus.
No, it's my gun. My police gun.
The Canadian actor had been the feature player in an Outer Limits episode in Season 2, where he played an astronaut who had returned from Venus a changed man. The mission had seemed a success, but he is haunted by a few minutes where he lost contact with mission control. Eventually, his memory is recovered, and it turns out he had seen an alien creature just outside his window. This, of course, wasn't the first time he saw something crazy through a window mid-flight. Perhaps this is why, with the next project offered to him after Incubus, they gave him such a big window. And look, everyone with him will be facing that window, so no one ever again can ignore him when he tries to explain he saw something fantastical outside the window of a craft.
Capsule touchdown. Welcome back, William Shatner. What a day for you.
Is you shooting up?
Oh my God.
Give me a champagne bottle. Come here. I want one. Here. You want a little of this?
The champagne showers have begun. William Shatner taking in the moment clearly.
Interestingly, Shatner claims that Roddenberry tinkered with the idea of filming Star Trek in Esperanto, which of course would be a perfect ideological match for the Star Trek ethos, but perhaps not a great idea commercially. Technically, there have been 4 feature films shot exclusively in Esperanto. The last 2 are both shot on cheap DV, and an article on an Esperanto website describes them as, quote, pretty watchable and, quote, very suitable for classroom use. With all respect to the filmmakers, this lack of full-throated endorsement under these ideal circumstances makes me reticent to mention them at all. Also, if I'm being honest, outside of 28 Days Later, it's hard for me to consider many shot-on-DV movies actual movies. Be sure to check downstairs in the comments to find all the David Lynch Inland Empire apologists blasting me. This leaves us with just Incubus, and the first film made entirely in Esperanto, whose title is translated as Agonies, and according to Wikipedia, seems to have had a rocky reception from the Esperantists, resulting in the director himself in a fit of passion destroying nearly all copies. But fortunately, we have Incubus, right? Leslie Stevens purportedly pitched the Esperanto aspect of the film as, in part, a clever shortcut to ticket sales. According to Shatner,
he said there are 7 million people who speak Esperanto. It will reach all 7 million people.
Of course, you know there might only be like
3 people in Detroit and 5 people in New York who spoke Esperanto. Nobody spoke Esperanto in any large numbers.
Which of course is not a great strategy for actually getting distribution in film theaters across the country. There was no plan B of being, God help us, rolled into a streaming content library at a later date. He didn't know what he didn't know, but one thing he did know that he didn't know was Esperanto. And do you know who else knew they didn't know Esperanto? Absolutely everyone involved in the making of Incubus. Stevens himself penned the script in English, had someone translate it into Esperanto, and then showed up for filming with no one on set who understood the language. The actors themselves rehearsed in English, and then learned their Esperanto dialogue phonetically.
With no one on set to guide them, accents vacillate wildly between kind of Italian to vaguely Eastern European.
Siesta dolce.
The aspecto es buona.
Fresce pure aero revivismen.
This didn't stop Stevens from declaring that everyone on set should communicate exclusively in Esperanto, a fact I've seen confirmed from multiple interviews from multiple people who worked on the picture. But unfortunately, there never seems to be any follow-up anecdote of the ensuing chaos of such a demand, which leads me to assume that that pact made between the filmmaker and film crew was abandoned as quickly as the one formed by Zamenhof and his teenage friends on his 19th birthday. You know, Quentin Tarantino doesn't really like to talk about his actual first film, My Best Friend's Birthday.
Okay, he's opened up a Pandora's box and he's gonna wish it kept closed. Because he's getting me pissed. And when I get pissed, watch out.
When he talks about making only 10 films before retiring, see my previous video, that one is not acknowledged in that sacred number. Maybe it was only a trial run, so he can claim he came out of the gates blasting with Reservoir Dogs. So let's permit Zamenhof that same grace and say that his first true universal language was really launched in 1887 when he was 28, and it was called Esperanto. He tirelessly distributed literature and evangelized for this language, and I use that term deliberately. For him, the language was never an end unto itself, but a bridge of cultures. A tent broad enough for Jews, Christians, Muslims. He had become disillusioned with Zionism, but more explicitly, any form of nationalism. He traveled to spread the word. He would ultimately have 3 children, Adam, Sophia, and Lydia. He struggled to afford food as his family grew. He struggled to get anyone to adopt his constructed language, and made very little headway, despite positive reception from some, including Leo Tolstoy of all people. But then, the French. God bless them, the French. But the enthusiasm from the French would prove to have dire ramifications for Zamenhof's inclusivist ideology. Leslie Stevens was himself a bit of a mystic. Some of his ideas are even highlighted in the book Taoism for Dummies. I suspect he was familiar with the history of Esperanto's universalism and lofty humanistic ideology, so I would guess this played a role in why he argued for the use of Esperanto in this film to contribute to the otherworldly nature of the story and the aesthetic, and certainly the Eden-like setting of the film. Ironic then that the on-set production was cursed by a hippie. That's right, a hippie. That most spiritual phylum of God's dirty beatniks. William Shatner will assure you that it was indeed a hippie, explaining to delighted listeners of the DVD commentary.
Because those were the days when hippies abounded, and there was this wailing curse laid on us.
The story goes that the crew was unkind to or dismissive of a passing hippie on location, and said hippie cursed them. This incident became the stuff of legends when so many things tied to the film's production turned out so bleakly. Shatner's commentary on the Incubus DVD swings through wild extremes of hilarious rants and bizarrely incisive philosophical reflections.
The look of non-comprehension, the somewhat desperate look in the actors' faces, which seems like not comprehending fate and good and evil and the magnificent works of God, was not that at all. It was not comprehending Leslie Stevens speaking Esperanto.
Plus, you get insane rants about the actor Milos, who shows up later in the film.
It was a creepy guy. But what does that mean, creepy guy? It means that he believed in evil, and he was evil. He breathed evil. He ate evil. He smelled of evil. Of course, that could be that he never took a shower and ate garlic, but it doesn't matter. M&Ms were named after Milos. They're hard on the outside, soft on the inside, and I believe Milos was that very thing.
The film's opening credits appear over pagan wood carvings and opens with pastoral images of what appears to be an appropriately Eden-like paradise, and an opening voiceover tells us that this village of Namen Tum contains healing waters that can make people more attractive, and therefore attracts the corrupt and infirm.
Gloi, la villaggio farigis chas loco por demonoi. Aperantai kiel junai virinoi, tiui demonoi altiras maculita in anim.
We are introduced to such a man, washing in the restorative waters, flirting with one of these witchy young women, and ultimately meeting his end. The entire film is available on YouTube, but unfortunately from a nasty interlaced transfer, which is a terrible impression of how the film actually looked. For a low-budget movie that seems to struggle even under the weight of its modest ambitions, the cinematography is often beautiful. As identified by many, you can spot the scenic seaside beauty of Ingmar Bergman, the sun-dappled painterly visuals of Akira Kurosawa, and while it never reaches the heights of Night of the Hunter, the striking images of the drowned corpse reminds me of Charles Laughton's Singular Film. These visuals were primarily done by Conrad Hall, who went on to win 3 Academy Awards, though near the end of filming he was replaced by William Fraker, who himself was no slouch, as he DP'd Rosemary's Baby and Bullet, has 5 Oscar nominations, and most importantly was the cinematographer on Street Fighter.
I know you like to look at yourself on television, you sick son of a bitch, so look at this.
Kaya debriefs with one of her associates, Amal, and explains that she has taken 3 souls today. She then expresses dissatisfaction with luring already tainted souls to their dark lord.
Min kapti corruptitain animoin. Kiel ni devas malbone uze.
After all, wouldn't they find their way to the pit regardless? Kaya wishes to capture the noble soul of a saint, despite protests from Amel.
Animo pirua kai bono sen ombro de peco.
Fratino, estu zorga.
Miavas povoin amael. Povoin estael.
So Kaya approaches a monastery and observes monks all doing, well, un-monkey things. Like turning a cross around, burying something suspicious, and sucking on... I'm not sure what that is.
I do that regularly.
Incubus was filmed primarily at Big Sur and a mission not far away. Director Stevens was, rightfully, fearful that the pagan themes of the film would scare away any local permissions for these locations, so he went about creating a fake feature-length screenplay entitled Old Religious Legends of Monterey, which broadly matched what they would be filming for the actual film. So, as recorded in his fantastic essay on Incubus, author David Scow explains that in this alternate screenplay, a monk is described as burying breakfast garbage, whereas in the original screenplay, he is described as burying either treasure, offal, or, and I quote, a dead infant. Kaya retreats from the monastery, finding no noble soul, and we start to confirm a troubling trend wherein most of the screen time is spent watching people walk from here to there to pad the runtime. It's bizarre that this was the screenplay Stevens wanted to make away from the Outer Limits series, as it feels pretty obviously like what should be a 45-minute TV episode stretched out to not even 75 minutes. To put an even finer point on it, the fake screenplay of Old Religious Legends of Monterey was a mere 57 pages long, and at these mere 57 pages was actually longer than the actual Incubus screenplay. Enter Mark, a noble soldier who has returned from battle to recover with his sister. Appropriate for the film's mythic style, the two live on a farm, and there's no real sense of a greater society or other people outside of that idea of a battle from which he has returned.
Milos este vero, que tu reciac von havas curits provon.
Kaya approaches the farmhouse, claiming to be a traveler with a failing memory. Mark invites her to join him, safe from the forest, and presents her with food and wine. This scene, as all others, plays out simplistically, like a parable or like a creation myth. There isn't really character development, rather archetypes, like a missing story from the book of Genesis. It is then that, appropriately, an eclipse occurs, and when it resolves, Kaya says she will leave.
Estas tempo farire.
Mark, having become smitten with her in these few moments, declares that he will accompany her. Meanwhile, his angelic sister has gone mysteriously blind.
Marco! Marco! Marco, help me!
It's unclear if the eclipse itself caused the blindness or if she was cursed by Amel. There is a haunting cruelty with which this character is treated, and for all the ways the film can register as silly, there is a bitter darkness that pervades. There's something truly haunting about the actress's performance during this sequence.
Help me, Marco!
Weeks after filming Ann Atmar, the actress would take her own life at age 27 before the film was released. It's difficult to find information about Ann Atmar's personal life, try as I might. And so much of the final footage we have of her is her fumbling in her blindness, crying out for help in her darkness.
Help me, Marco! Ah, Marco!
Mark wanders through the woods with Kaya as she tries to convince him to go down to the sea, and the filmmakers make an unusual cut to insert a shot of the body of the man, unceremoniously still being tossed by the waves, an ominous warning. The flirty couple continue to frolic until they kiss. He asks that they return to the farmhouse, while she insists that they dry themselves in the dunes, suggesting they do so naked.
Riposi in la sonno. Nuda.
Mi desiras que nu estu cum mi. Mi volas haven infanon.
You'd be excused for assuming this exchange suggests the film is a morality play, but we'll soon see that it is not the case, and that rather than re-rendering a sort of stark moral justice like the story of Eden found in Genesis, the film will show us an agnostic amorality, where chaos dictates consequences more than moral righteousness.
Mi desiras riposi in la sonno.
Kaya.
Apud la maro. Je la fino de la terra. Je la fino de la mondo.
To lie in the sun at the land's end, by the sea at the edge of the world, is perhaps the most beautiful sentiment spoken in the film. But it comes out of the mouth of someone with the intent to deceive, and we are immediately shown what she actually means by another shocking smash cut. Kaya compares her desire for him to be like the eclipse, and Mark grabs her to kiss her more passionately, with, indeed, their faces eclipsing the sun. In the film's most ambiguous moment that is never fully resolved, is this moment a win for love, or is it Mark's descent into fleshly temptation? Mark's innocent sister Arndis continues to stumble around blind, and Kaya's associate Amel demands that she stop her brother, who is now carrying a sleeping Kaya into the cathedral. But she is too late, and Kaya awakens in the cathedral. Hysterical upon seeing the religious iconography, she flees. As she weeps, her sister Amel explains to her that what happened to her was holy rape. The only way to get revenge is to call forth the Incubus. Arndis finds her way to her brother, and her eyesight is restored upon entering the cathedral. They head home, and he remains burdened with the thought of Kaya, who he doesn't seem to have any regrets about. Arndis sweetly tells him, Meanwhile, the witches pray to their dark god and call forth the Incubus to get their revenge. Mark dreams of a beckoning Kaya and a drowned man. He wakes and goes out searching for the beckoning call, which appears to be coming from the Incubus, hanging Michael Keaton Batman style upside down. While Mark continues to search, the Incubus flies down to the farmhouse. And in yet another haunting scene, gets Arndis to follow him to what the witches describe ominously as the bridal chamber. She sees the cloaked figures and screams before they collapse onto her and strip her of her clothes in a brief scene of nudity, which at the time caused a minor scandal. According to the producer Anthony Taylor, it caused a greater furor than what follows, which is the Incubus descending on her to ravage her. Again, escalating the remarkably dark nature of the film. According to Anthony Taylor, after the film was released, they later filmed some nude scenes with a girl doubling as Kaya in his backyard, thinking that splicing them in might add in some lurid appeal, by leaping on the burgeoning nudie cutie bandwagon.
Her dance has pleased me.
Hello. I saw you on the throne before. You must be the queen.
Led by the likes of Russ Meyer.
Much later, Billy. Let her be.
A man, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess, is the only person in history for whom nearly all of his obituaries mention his love of large breasts. Is it a dubious honor when even NPR feels the need to mention your love for big boobs when you die?
He was a breast fetishist, and he was once accused of that. He said, "You're nothing but a breast man." And he said, that's only the half of it.
You decide. Regardless, this pornographized version of Incubus was never released and is now lost entirely. It appears to have only been seen by, strangely, Francis Ford Coppola, of all people, because his assistant at the time was friends with producer Taylor. Ironically, Coppola himself, while studying at UCLA Film School, cut his teeth filming nude scenes to add into other films, like The Bellboy and the Playgirls, which combines his nude footage with a German melodrama.
Mark? That makes me so nervous.
Yeah.
Or like Tonight for Sure, which combined a Western entitled Wide Open Spaces with his short film The Peeper. Eventually, legendary producer Roger Corman asked a teacher at UCLA if she had spotted any talent, and she recommended Coppola, and the rest is history. I can't help but also bring up an even deeper cut for film history nerds. That teacher who recommended Coppola to Corman? None other than legendary director Dorothy Arzner. I know her best from her fantastic curiosity of a film, Dance Girl Dance, which stars, and I'm not kidding, Lucille Ball as an exotic burlesque dancer, pre-I Love Lucy superstardom.
The highbrow, what an awful plight. Gotta say goodbye now.
It has a very fun place in the canon of classic films that have undergone critical reassessment by feminist film criticism, but that's a story for another day. So, the titular Incubus is played by a Yugoslavian actor named Milos. His film career began as a stand-in for ultra-cool French actor Alain Delon,
a French film star who has caused ladies to pass out at the very sight of him.
When Delon was in America, apparently he would hang out with decidedly not super cool American actor Mickey Rooney and Rooney's wife, Barbara Thomason.
I was already sitting down. You gotta move this back on. You get it off its mark. We'll never be able to see it.
This would have been right around the time of filming the movie most people under the age of 50 associate Rooney with. The yellow-faced portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi spoiling the good fun of Breakfast at Tiffany's, with the typical for the time horribly racist tomfoolery of giving a white guy glasses and buck teeth and trusting that a wildly offensive Asian accent will produce comedy gold.
If I do not have fire, then smoke get in your eyes. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell. You disturb me. You must have a key made.
Mickey Rooney began trying to get his new buddy Milos work around Hollywood. Mickey claimed he was addicted to women and would often cheat on his wife Barbara, with whom he had 4 children. Well, it turns out that Barbara decided to cheat on Mickey with Milos, leading to her and Mickey temporarily separating. The problem was, well, in addition to all the infidelity, the problem was that Milos was a bit crazy. For example, for fun, he would reportedly race his sexy sports car toward pedestrians until they leapt out of the way. Or, for example, he told a friend of Barbara's that, quote, if Barbara even looks at another man, I'll shoot her and myself. It'll be like a film. We'll be found sleeping like 2 lovers together. Or, for example, when Mickey was in the hospital and asked for Barbara to meet him so they could discuss whether to divorce or reconcile, and Milos made Barbara wear a microphone in her bra for the meeting with a private eye surreptitiously recording the conversation. During that conversation, Barbara admitted that she would be willing to end things with Milos and reconcile, forgetting that the conversation was being recorded by a PI that refused to give her the tape and instead returned with her to Milos, where he played it for them and some friends staying as house guests. The next morning, someone called the house, and daughter Kelly answered, explaining Mommy's still asleep. One of the house guests present the previous night went to the house and broke into the bedroom. There, she found Barbara lying on the bathroom floor with a bullet in her jaw. Milos was dead next to her with a bullet in his temple. He had used Mickey's gun to carry out his murder-suicide. Mark returns home in time for the Incubus to unceremoniously toss his near-dead sister to the ground.
Sia animo el blu e l'impero.
Mark attacks the Incubus, echoing Cain and Abel, or perhaps Jacob wrestling the angel, not for a blessing this time, but rather for vengeance. Or maybe Mark's journey is that of the trials of Job. Can his soul remain intact when everything is taken away from him? The sudden surge in interest in Esperanto from the French did not reduce Zamenhof's own trials. Paradoxically, it was his Jewishness that made the French suspicious toward him and his language, while it was his insistence upon universalism rather than Zionism that made it so he was an outcast among his own people, leading to a tormented and embattled life. He was urged to hide his Jewishness from the heavily secularized French intelligentsia and was urged to remove a prayer from an address he wrote them. Tearful, isolated, apprehensive, he refused to change the speech, but agreed to drop the final stanza of the prayer, which declared that Christian, Jews, or Mohammedans, we are all children of God. The politics of the dissemination of Esperanto from this point through Zamenhof's death of heart failure in 1917 complicates exponentially. He was survived by his 3 children, but soon World War II would begin, and Esperantists would specifically be targeted for execution by the Nazis and sentenced to the Gulag or death by Stalin.
Como esta maculita pesanco.
The trials of Mark end with him choosing vengeance.
Daarvan, neniuis tiet, mi povus forcune cune.
Isantis, in animum mortigi.
Kaya, now won over by love and regret, urges Mark to run away with her, while he sees visions of darkness.
Estas figurora butelantaya on a pairo aero. Soon explode. Luminoi.
Eventually, he looks in the distance and sees the mysterious great beast awaiting him on his path, and behind him he hears church bells toll. Kaya urges him not to return, saying his soul belongs to her, but now her tenor seems sincere and filled with genuine love rather than scorn. As he walks back toward the church, he begs her to help him.
Fratino al conducto.
Kaya's sister has just enough energy to resurrect the Incubus. And when Kaya is just about to cross the threshold into the cathedral, he stops her. Insisting upon love, she does the sign of the cross, and the Incubus transforms into a black goat that descends upon her and ravages her until she proclaims she belongs to the god of light. Mark is able to pull her battered body across the threshold where the beast can't reach them, but it seems like it might be too late for both of them. A thought cut short by the film's final shot of the beast, stopped in a freeze frame and inverted. When Incubus was first screened at the San Francisco Film Festival, attended by a similarly cursed couple, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, the film began and there was no sound. It turned out the print had no soundtrack, and so it took a drunk Stevens an hour to acquire another copy, while 5,000 patrons waited, screaming and hollering. When the film finally began again, the 50 to 100 Esperantists who were in the audience shouted and heckled the film, laughing at the poor pronunciation by the actors. The film was received poorly everywhere, except in, wait for it, France. The Jerry Lewis-loving, Esperanto-ruining French loved Incubus, and so they ended up being the unwitting custodians of a lost film for 30 years until Anthony Taylor discovered they had a copy in 1996, where he unearthed it.
Mi desiras riposi in la suno.
Kaya.
Apud la maro. Je la fino de la terra. Je la fino de la mondo.
By the time the film entered theaters,
Vivere nelegas
Anne Atmar had taken her own life.
Se decentes que plore,
Milos had killed Barbara Thomason and himself. And the first episode of Star Trek had aired.
Dead, Jim. It's strange.
Director Leslie Stevens was married to Kaya actress Allison Ames, but their marriage ended in divorce that year. His production company never made another movie. The actress who played Kaya's sister, Amel, had the most successful acting career of the women in the film. 2 years after Incubus, her 17-year-old daughter was abducted from her driveway. 2 days later, her body was found off Mulholland Drive, repeatedly stabbed, and her face brutally beaten. It remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Zamenhof's dream for Esperanto as a language that could reshape the world and shed it of its prejudices never came to fruition. He would die believing it to be a failure. And so his language, lovingly wished into existence at a boy's 19-year-old birthday party, is now a prayer that we dare not pray in the modern age, perhaps for fear of being similarly disillusioned of our remaining modest hopes. For it is too naively grand for a world that is cursed. So it remains a prayer that may only be spoken in tongues, that a shared language shall provide truth rather than disinformation. That our souls might become unstained. That we no longer would allow nation, identity, or religion to dehumanize others. That we may be restored with our loved ones to lie in the sun at the land's end, by the sea at the edge of the world.